shown here have the property that the outcomes of your actions, whether good or bad or indifferent, are delayed and contingent on many things that happen after you take that action. So, this video game character has to jump over here and climb down here and jump over this thing that I think is a skull to pick up this gem, I think it is, that actually is the thing that earns points. And so deciding what to do involves connecting actions to their consequences non-locally over long distances of space and time when your brain's in sort of literally a different state, some seconds or minutes later. And that makes figuring out what connecting your actions to their consequences difficult. It makes, in particular, learning them difficult. And in reinforcement learning, that's known as a problem of temporal credit assignment. And it shows up even in the sort of classic, I won't belabor too many equations today, but this is the classic equation of reinforcement learning as we use in computational models in neuroscience and in AI as well. The idea is that the agent is trying to optimize something. They're trying to optimize the sum of future rewards. And so that's a sort of long nested sum over not just the points you're going to score immediately, but the points you're going to score on multiple steps later, summing over many possible sort of steps through the world or trajectories through the world you might take. And so you can see already here that just what you're trying to do involves making decisions now based on things that are going to happen later. And this is a hard computation and hard to learn. Okay, so today I'd like to talk about, sort of jump off from this problem and talk about how we think this happens in the brain, first theoretically, and then testing some of these theoretical ideas with a study in people. So I think historically, one thing I've been interested in, and of course the department and many groups here had a long history as well of investigating these ideas. There's been a strong sense that the brain takes kind of multiple approaches to solve this kind of selection problem. You might know it as goal direction and habitual, for instance, but the idea that on the one hand, there are sort of computation heavy sort of mental simulation and deliberative type approaches like goal-directed behavior that involve sort of thinking through possible paths or routes in a spatial task or consequences of action in a lever pressing task. In computer science, that's known as model-based reinforcement learning. That is using a map or model, a mental cognitive map or a mental model of the world to simulate the consequences of actions and then evaluate them and decide what to do. This gives rise to flexibility if your goals change or something about the map or the task changes, but it's clearly very computationally laborious. And there's an alternative, which is the sort of habitual or automatic system or approach, which is to simply learn what to do in different circumstances, in effect kind of reusing computation that you might have done previously rather than sort of running through it again. This is, among other things, associated with the classic account of the phasic dopamine response due to Schultz here and collaborators in the 90s. That is known as model-free reinforcement learning because it doesn't rely on mental simulations using an internal model of the environment. It instead directly uses this prediction error signal to figure out what to do. But it, of course, has this famous inflexibility, this habitual phenomena where you have frets lever pressing for food they don't want or so on. That is, these reused values can become sort of out of date and inappropriate if things like your goals change. And of course, there's a sort of classic view on this dichotomy, which is due, among others, to Everett and Robbins here, that imbalance in this and overexpression of habits might give rise to symptoms of compulsion, such as in drug abuse. Okay, so that's the sort of background, and a little more background just about how I've worked on this problem. Is that in my own work, sort of getting to where what I'm actually going to talk about today, we've been interested in, and Deborah mentioned this paper, formalizing or sort of coming up with a sort of a computational model of this goal directed versus habitual distinction in terms of these two deliberative and automatic, or these two strategies for reinforcement learning, model based and model free. And we were interested in sort of viewing this as a sort of all or nothing trade-off between should I think, should I deliberate and figure out what to do, or should I just act according to a habit? That was sort of how we construed the problem at the time. And that we suggested gave a kind of rational benefit, a sort of cost benefit account of when animals exhibit habits and when they exhibit goal-directed behavior, and many different manipulations, such as overtraining, that cause them to transition from one to the other, could be understood in terms of rationally when is it worth thinking and when you should just go ahead and act. We also have done a lot of work using trial and error decision tasks in people, sort of stripped down multi-step tasks that attempt to measure the extent to which people are engaging in model-based planning or not, through their trial by trial choice adjustments in these types of tasks that can reveal whether they contemplate multiple steps, and in turn trying to connect that to test these ideas from Barry and Trevor and so on about whether they relate, whether deficiencies, let's say in planning, relate to symptoms of drugs of abuse, like compulsive symptoms or other psychiatric symptoms involving drug abuse and OCD and so on. And Claire Gillen, Valerie Voon here is someone else we've worked on that with. So what I'd like to do today is go beyond this kind of dichotomy and try to think more in a sort of much more granular fashion about this model-based planning and how is it the brain simulates and what does it simulate. So let's talk a little bit about what we know about it and why we think that even rats do this. So the sort of classic experimental design, as I'm sure you all know, by which it's been argued that even rats engage in some sort of cognitive map planning goes back to Tolman. And they're these sort of multi-phase tasks, right? So they have, first the animal is exposed to something like, let's say, a spatial maze. Then separately, they're taught about the rewards, but crucially not allowed to traverse the path to where they say to put at the end and show them that there's a reward here. And then in a test phase, they're asked to put that knowledge together and figure out where to go. Right, and the reward evaluation task that's been used with instrumental lever pressing has the sort of same kind of logic as this. So what's seen is that animals are able to sort of make the right choice in phase 3 on average, and people can do this too. We've tested this. That is, they have to put together information about the structure of the maze, where the barriers are, the map, within separately obtain information about the rewards to figure out which way to go, right? So it requires kind of integration, and in particular, sort of simple habit learning rules like the one associated with dopamine, temporal difference learning, can't do this because they don't learn a map of the world, for instance. So the standard interpretation of these experiments, what people had in mind is that the way animals figure out what to do, let's say in phase 3, is through this sort of forward mental simulation at decision time, right? That the animal's sitting here thinking, okay, if I go left and right, then I get to the cheese. Whether that's right or not is another question, and we'll come back to that, but that's at least, that was sort of what people had in mind. There's another thing that people have in mind, which is not at all proven, but I think is an exciting hypothesis, and that is that there might be a neural correlate of this sort of mental simulation in the hippocampus. So as you all, I'm sure, know, the hippocampus has cells, place cells that are tuned for locations as the animal runs through them. The cell fires action potentials. If you listen to a whole bunch of these neurons, you can decode where the animal thinks he is as he's running around. But slightly less famously, these neurons also sometimes, when the animal is standing still, code for locations where the animal isn't. So these things called sharp wave events or sharp wave ripples, in which the hippocampal population traverses a trajectory of coherent, sort of adjacent locations, but they're not where the animal is actually is. And they happen very rapidly. So what's shown here running on repeat is a decode from Pfeiffer and Foster, one example. So this is where the animal is. The turquoise dot here is where he's about to run to, but right now he's standing still. And over about 100, 120 milliseconds, his brain is sort of representing a path to that destination, and then he runs there. And this, this is an anecdote, but they quantify this, and many other people have quantified this as well. And so the idea is that potentially this replay might serve to do what the animal's doing here, which is connecting the action he's taking down here, like turning left, to the consequences over here, like getting food. So it's sort of solving the problem that we started with, or at least it would be appropriate to do so. So it looks like we might be seeing mental simulation in like literally just seeing it here. That would be very exciting if it were true. And again, I want to emphasize that we don't necessarily have the evidence that this hypothesis is right, but let's take it seriously for a moment and think about what we could learn from this if it were true. And I was excited about this because I've been interested in this type of goal-directed simulation for a long time, but it's very hard, as you might imagine from the discussion we've just had about latent learning and rodent navigation, to discern much about it from behavior alone. So having a direct neural window on it is very exciting. So I think there's a few things that we could learn about immediately just by looking at this example. So the first one is that this is a trajectory, right? It's not a cone, it's not a sphere, right? The animal's thinking about one path at a time, and that's presumably because the hippocampus is an attractor network, right? So it can't represent more than one location at a time. And so that implies that whatever, if this sort of planning is search, that it's serial, right? That they have to think about one path and another path and another path. They can't just think about all of them at once. So that's already not obvious. The other thing is that the animal's standing still, right? And if the animal's not standing still, then the hippocampus represents, where he is, give or take. And that's, I think, again, because the hippocampus being only able to represent, more or less one location at a time, can either guide ongoing navigation or it can plan, but it can't do both at the same time. It can't represent multiple locations. That means that thinking has opportunity cost, right? It means that you can either deliberate or you can act, but you can't kind of deliberate while you're acting, at least in this particular domain. So I think those are very exciting, very illuminating possibilities. We even know kind of how fast this goes, right? So this is about 20 times faster than the animal runs, maybe, but not 1,000 times faster. So it takes time. Now, there's a few other things about this that are sort of puzzling at first glance. And when I first started talking to my friend and collaborator, Lauren Frank, who does these types of experiments in Hippocampus, he said to me, this is all hogwash. And the reason it's all hogwash is because this doesn't look like planning. So for instance, in my hands, I see more backward replay, which is sort of rewinding where the animal came from, rather than forward replay, which is thinking about where the animal is going to go. In fact, I don't see much forward replay at all in my own experiments. So that's weird. And the other thing that's weird, and he just recently published a paper making this point, is that a lot of this replay doesn't go to places where the animal is going to go. It goes to places where the animal ends up deciding not to go, and in particular places where he might be tempted to go but shouldn't. Like places where there used to be rewards, but he's just found out there isn't one. And that seems like, at least naively, both these things seem like evidence against sort of a naive construal of the plain English word deliberation or planning, that you're thinking about things you're going to do. But what we mean by connecting up actions with their consequences can happen many different ways. First of all, I don't have to just think about the consequences of my immediate possible actions. I just need to connect things to each other over space. So it's not merely thinking about paths ahead of me that can do that. And if I'm trying to figure out whether it's worth going somewhere, thinking about it and figuring out that it's not worth going there is a perfectly good instance of that. So actually, one of the things this is good for is telling me where not to go. It's about kind of evaluation and not just anticipation, right? That's what, exactly why planning is not just anticipation. Okay, so that's, I think, what, those are a number of observations about how this activity works in the brain. And it led myself and my former postdoc, Marcelo Matar, to sort of try to come up with a theory that could try to predict why it is that the animals think about particular paths at certain times, why they think about backward ones and other ones altogether, when they do it and when they don't. And the reason that is that the seriality and the opportunity cost of this really opened the question. You can't think about everything at once, and there's a sort of sparsity to it. So the sort of question of prioritization seems like the important question. So that's what I'd like to present today, or starting next, is sort of how we construe that question, and what's the model that we built of that. So we wanted to build a sort of first principle model of deliberation, what paths should the animal think about, and why. But the first thing I want to say is, there's really nothing special about forward planning. And in particular, if you think of this example of the rat who has to get to the cheese, in principle, he could put the information about the map of the maze and the location of the reward together anytime. He doesn't have to wait. As soon as he finds out about the reward, he doesn't have to wait until the point when he's put at the front of the maze to make that decision. He could have already figured it out before. Right, the behavior doesn't tell you whether or not he did. So, for instance, he'd get the cheese, and he could find the cheese, and he'd be like, "Hey, there's cheese here. How could I get here?" And then he could think sort of backwards to the start of the maze, because that's a place that he's been before, and that would teach him the same thing. Or he'd go to sleep between phase 2 and 3 and like dream about running down the path and finding cheese, and that would also do the same thing. And in fact, in a series of sort of fMRI studies with people with sort of analogous designs, we've shown that sort of reinstatement, both forward at time 3 and backwards at time 2. That study is actually not ours, it's Wimmer and Shahami. And in between 2 and 3, when people are just resting, all of those things can support sort of or associated with correct performance on these test phases, right? So it doesn't have to be forward planning. It does have to be activity that connects the start to the finish. But that can happen in many different times and patterns. And again, that just again highlights the fact that selecting what you're going to dream about when and what you're going to think about, if it doesn't even just has to be what you're going to do right now, is a really important issue in all of this. Okay, so here's the model, again, from Marcelo Matar and myself. And what we're going to do is we're going to sort of build on a basic operation, which we call a Bellman backup, but it's basically, again, the sort of Schultz-Diane-Montague model of dopamine neurons. It says, at any point, I can imagine taking a step from location A to location B, adjacent location, and I'm going to push information about what I know about the value in this state and any reward I know about being here back over that step. This is in fact what the temporal difference prediction error does with real experience, we think, under this sort of Schultz-Diane-Montague. So the sort of dopamine circuit can do that. If you feed it with simulated experience instead of real experience, the same circuit can drive learning over simulated trajectories instead of actual ones. And we suggest that you could use that sort of building block to sort of push information around. So therefore, the question that we face is, if I'm a rat standing still thinking about paths, which locations should I think about doing this in sort of what order, given what I know so far in this sort of task? And our proposal is that you're going to sort of from first principles kind of write down what would be the most useful step to think about in terms of sort of how much more cheese would I earn in the future if I think about it. So we're going to write down the expected utility in terms of units of future cheese of each of these steps of thinking. We're going to find that as we're going to call that the expected value of backup, because this is a backup. And again, thinking can earn you cheese because it can help you make better choices later. So it really does have value in units of cheese. The trick is computing what that is, or figuring out what that is. Okay, so the core of this paper is a beautiful theorem from Marcello that I won't, again, belabor the equations, but it basically computes this EVB, which is the quantity that says what place should I think about at a particular moment, in terms of two factors. So again, the EVB is defined as how much cumulative future discounted cheese do I expect to earn if I think about this place compared to not thinking about this place compared to the status quo. How is it going to improve my choices? And that turns out to factor into the product of two things. And these are known as need times gain, after famous modeling work in the memory literature, actually, by John Anderson. So the need, so EVB is like an expected utility. It's like the probability times the magnitude. So need is like probability. It says, I should think about some location if I'm likely to visit that location soon. Because I'm not likely to visit the location soon, I can think about all I want, but I'm not going to be able to sort of cash in on that thinking. So if I'm going to earn anything from this, it's because I'm going to pass through there. So need is about future occupancy. Gain is about, if I do get there, how much better a decision am I going to make, right? So some place I could think about it and it's not going to change my mind. Some place I'm going to think about it, it's going to potentially shed some light on something and make me make a better turn and get to the choose faster. Those are the ones that are going to earn me gain. So EVB is the product of those two things. Where am I going to be and what would I earn by thinking about it? And so the idea then is just to compute this for every possible location. This is not like a process level model, which is sort of an in-principle model of what should the animal think about if we think about this in first principles. The program runs through every possible location and decides which one is going to have the best product of need and gain. These are the equations, but for reasons I'll unpack in a second, these tend to push replay in front of the animal and these tend to push replay behind the animal. And so they can actually jointly, their sort of dynamics of being multiplied together account for the fact that replay sometimes runs forward and sometimes runs backward, which is one of Lauren's objections. Okay. So why does need push forward? It's because it's about places you're going to visit soon, right? So my future discounted occupancy of internal location on the maze is clearly places that are near to me. So all else equal, need wants to push replay forward toward places the animal is likely to want to go soon. And in cases where the animal already knows paths to follow, it's most likely that they're going to be on that path. So need actually is sort of structured. So this is the kind of thing you get from replay in situations where need is simulations in the model, where need is driving replay. Gain is sort of the opposite. It wants to drive replay backward. And the reason that is that gain tells you about how much can I learn at a particular location. And so can think of an example where the rat finds cheese for the first time. So now he knows one thing, which is that this is a space that's adjacent to cheese. So there's one space on the maze where that information is useful, and that's the space right behind him, because now if he simulates going up from that location to where he is now, that will teach him that cheese is available from there, and then he can think back one more step and teach him that cheese is available from there, and so on. And so information about cheese can propagate backward through the map. And that's why gain tends to drive replay backward, whereas need tends to drive it forward. And so in some circumstances, like when an animal just gets to the reward, then you tend to get backward replay because the gain dominates in this sort of product. Okay, so I'm not going to spend, so the paper is full of tons and tons of simulations of sort of lots of things from the hippocampal replay literature, lots of sort of regularities about when different patterns of replay are seen, and arguing that they can be understood under this theory that the replay is basically optimized for, or selected or prioritized for driving reinforcement learning. So for instance, just to give you a few examples, this is a classic findings from Buzaki that animals tend to think forward at the beginning of the task and then backwards once they get to the reward. by the way, this replay really is backwards, because in linear tracks, the hippocampal place fields are unidirectional, are tuned for direction as well. So you can see that they're rewinding backwards, like the animal's running backwards instead of simply representing a forward trajectory backward away from the cheese. But in any case, you get reverse replay once you get to the reward. And in our model, that's for the reason I just said. And so the model makes the same prediction, that you see forward replay at the start of a trial when they don't figure out what to do, and backward replay at the end of a trial when he gets the outcome and needs to propagate that around. Another thing which is a little bit subtler is that some surprising things trigger a lot of these sharp wave replays, like when an animal gets more food than expected, there's a lot of sharp wave ripples, but when the animal gets less food than expected, there's actually not a lot of sharp wave ripples. And when the animal gets shocked, there's a lot of them. So the model actually explains this pattern where some events produce actionable information. Like if you get a shock, you should really you should really think about not going back to that place. You should do something else instead, in a sort of place aversion kind of situation. But if you're shuttling on a track and a reward is all of a sudden missing, it doesn't really matter because you still have to shuttle. So you shouldn't actually replay. And so our model can reproduce sort of different patterns of events in which otherwise sort of surprising prediction error things drive replay or don't drive replay. And so sort of simple theories, which have predominated, at least in AI, that surprise drives replay sort of aren't good enough to explain which surprise matters and which surprise doesn't, but the way we compute gain does. And finally, just one more example. There's lots of work, there's some work on replay during sleep, and that is also biased towards certain events. So for instance, if animals see a path to food through glass and then sleep, but never get to run there until they wake up, there's preferential replay of running down the maze to the food of the place cells that turn out to be on that path once the animal wakes up and he runs there. And then the animal wakes up and runs there. And the model can reproduce that as well. Okay, so that's sort of a smattering of things, but there's a lot of them. So sort of wrapping up this sort of modeling exercise, what I'd like to say is that hopefully hippocampal replay is a window into this kind of value computation. And it sheds light on this question of selection, like which states and actions the animal considers win. And there are these very interesting patterns and sort of surprising and revealing patterns that, place cells do this in this situation and that in that situation. There's very rich dynamics and sort of regularities. And I think sort of evidence in favor of the interpretation of what replay is doing is that we can actually explain all this stuff. I think the sort of predominant view, I think previously before this work, and maybe still, is that these different types of replay do different things, basically because they happen in different circumstances and don't seem to relate to one another. But our argument is actually we have a sort of unified account of all these disparate phenomena, all from a basic single sort of desideratum. And I think it sheds a lot of light on what's going on. That being said, I would be the first to admit that these are not the right experiments to test this theory. These are not reinforcement learning experiments. Animals aren't really trying to do trial and error reinforcement learning for the most part in the studies that have been done in hippocampal place cells. And so what we're really excited to do, and one of the things I'm collaborating with Lauren and others on is actually having animals doing kind of trial and error reinforcement learning and trying to study whether, as they make choices and deliberate about possible actions, sharp wave ripples sort of push information about individual experienced rewards at different locations around to affect the choices. And the model makes very clear predictions about how animals' experiences will drive need and gain, which will sculpt replay, which will update values in the animals' heads, which will affect their choices. And so we, in principle, can sort of test and intervene upon each of these steps to see if this is right. And so that's a sort of exciting direction. what I'll do with the rest of my talk is tell you about a sort of rough human version of this. Of course, human experiments are much quicker to do than with animals. We're still, just getting started with rodents. But I can at least give you a feel for how this is going to go in kind of a rough draft. One other thing I wanted to say, just because in part I know a lot of people here are interested in it. One of the things I think is nice about this perspective is it goes beyond the sort of goals and habits view that compulsive behaviors are based on this kind of neglect that you do. You carry out these compulsive actions and you just, you're sick and you do dumb things because you don't deliberate enough. And this perspective that I've presented today, a lot of the importance is on the sort of more positive aspect of which are the things that you think about. And I think that sheds light on some other psychiatric phenomena that kind of go along with compulsion or, might relate to it, that are more positive, right? So like worry and rumination and craving and obsession. Peter Dayan has used this a version of this model lately to talk about PTSD and re-experience of trauma. I think we can think about these sort of, if there were dysfunction in the sort of mechanisms that steer this replay and the sort of need and gain, right, the prioritization, that would give rise to content biases, to things like rumination. And that in turn would connect these cognitive symptoms to behavioral symptoms like avoidance and distorted choices in general, or craving to compulsion. And so I think it's a nice way of thinking about extending our sort of space of mechanisms to capture a kind of broader swath of, very broadly speaking, of psychiatric symptoms. Okay, so that's one chunk of the talk, and I have a shorter second chunk to finish with, which is an experiment. And again, I want to stress that human experiments are very limited with respect to these questions, obviously. So part of the spirit in which I present this is as a sort of rough draft of the kind of thing we're hoping to do in animals. But it's, I think, interesting in its own sort as well. So what we did, and this was in collaboration with Yunse Liu and Tim Behrens here, and Ray Dolan here in the UK, and also again Marcelo. And the goal was to have humans do a trial and error learning task, which requires them to sort of push information from one location to another, and then measure replay the best way we can, which is using magnetoencephalography, MEG. So that allows us to get kind of fast readout, very noisy, but fast readout of replay, and we want to try to connect it to choices. So in particular, you can sort of, the things we want to ask can sort of be conceptualized as living on a triangle. So one question is just, does trajectory replay actually support this kind of non-local learning that is connecting actions to outcomes over space and time? That's this arrow. Sorry, that's this arrow, replayed choices. And then there's this question of prioritization, sort of testing Marcelo's account of which things are thought about. So you can ask that question both behaviorally and neurally, right? You can ask behaviorally, do people actually learn more about the states that we think they should prioritize? Do their choices reflect better as though they were deliberating more about those ones? And neurally, we can ask, do they actually replay those paths more? Right, so that's the third arm of the triangle. So that's what I want to sort of convince you of today. And again, we go through this very briefly. So here's the task. It's not a spatial task. I'm drawing it as a spatial map, but it's actually presented as sort of an abstract series of objects, which we can decode using MEG. But imagine you have 3 rooms, orange, green, and blue. Every trial you start in one of them, and you can choose to run down 2 tunnels. Again, these tunnels are actually object sequences. And then you can arrive at 2, depending which tunnel you take, 2 goal locations, X and Y. At X and Y, you win or lose, you win money or you don't win money. And so what you're trying to do is figure out which one is richer, and these are sort of constantly changing. So you're trying to make the best choices and earn the most money. And the key point is, if I run down this path and get to X and win money, I can kind of learn directly from experience about that path. But with respect to other paths that lead to the same place, if I start in the green room or the blue room, that's a sort of non-local credit assignment problem, right? I've got to push this information about this reward up here, or back here. Or conversely, I might sit up here and think through back to here and recover information about the reward. But in any case, it's sort of like the latent learning problem. I found out something about a reward that tells me about a path that I haven't taken. So we're asking people to push information around, and we want to see if we can see that happening in their brain. First of all, I do it behaviorally. So we can see that by, for instance, if they run down this path to X and get rewarded for it compared to not getting rewarded for it, they're more likely to choose it again. So there's sort of simple sort of win, stay, lose, shift reinforcement learning. They're more likely to stay with a rewarded path. But importantly, they're also more likely to stay with the analogous path if we start them in another box. So if I run down here and get rewarded compared to not, then I start you in the green box. People are also good at choosing this path, the one that leads to the rewarded place instead of the other one, which again means they must have somehow gotten information about this reward up to here where they're making the decision, right? And again, our question is, how do I do that? So the first thing to say, just looking at the behavior before we get into the brain, is that there is evidence that if we sort of break this propagation down by priority, that it happens more reliably for paths that have higher need and gain, according to Marcello's theory. In particular, different paths have different need and gain for reasons I'm not going to unpack right now, but we can talk about it if you want. And what we do is we fit a trial and error learning model to this data, and we estimate a sort of step size that says how much effect does a reward have on my later choice from either local or non-local paths. Non-local paths that have high priority in terms of need or gain, only one of them is significant, the reward has a bigger impact as quantified by this learning rate. So it's 0.79 here and 0.37 here, for instance. So a high gain path is the reward has a much bigger effect, as though it were replayed more reliably. Okay, so that's the sort of first arm of the triangle. So how do we measure replay? So again, these locations aren't really locations, they're visual objects. And what we've done, as you may know, using neuroimaging, it's possible to decode people seeing or even thinking about particular visual categories from their brain activity. So there are a bunch of visual images here, and we separately train a classifier to decode their representations, and it's noisy but significantly works. And so we can try to see if we can measure replay while people are contemplating actions or processing rewards. So this is a tricky problem, even trickier than other things, because we don't really know when they're going to be doing this, what they're thinking about, like what to align on, what speed these hypothetical trajectories might be, and when they're going to happen, whether they go forward or backwards. And so the reason we teamed up, among other things, with Yunse, Tim, and Ray, is that they had done a lot of work figuring how to solve this problem in different types of tasks, and they have a sort of statistical method that they've used a number of times to measure the extent of forward or backward replay at different moments, basically estimating a giant GLM that tries to predict images on the basis of other images or image-related activity, and quantify the extent to which it's sequentially coherent for different speeds in different directions. It turns out all the action in our task is at the reward time. There's no sort of interesting stuff going on at choice time, so I'm going to present that. All the replays at outcome time, but there's interesting replay at outcome time. So here's what it looks like. This is, you know, representative, but very clean raw data. So this is a situation in which maybe representative. This is not representative. This is an illustration of actual data that's chosen to illustrate the things that we quantify noisier later. But in any case, here's what it is. This is a case where the person ran from the green down to the X. So what he actually saw was E1, E2, E3, and they got to X and he got reward. What you see I'm sorry, he ran down the blue. So he actually saw A1, A2, A3. What you see in his brain in this particular snippet is E3, E2, E1 backwards. E3, E2, E1, relatively slow. And then you see C3, C2, C1, relatively slow, that's this. And then later on you see A1, A2, A3, faster, that's this. So we see, and this turns out to be true, I'll show you the data in a second, fast forward replay of local paths, that is the path the person just took, and slow backward replay of non-local paths. And indeed, it turns out to be the case. There's fast forward replay. This is the replay strength as a function of the state-to-state time difference. There's a peak around 30 milliseconds of significant forward replay, and the significant backward replay slower at around 140 milliseconds. And if you break that down by whether those particular sequences are local or non-local, there's this perfect kind of double dissociation. There's forward replay, like I said, of local sequences and backward replay of non-local sequences. So the backward replay of non-local sequences, of course, is what we're interested in, because that's what could solve the computational problem we have. But I think it's striking, there's something real, there's a real clear signature of two different things going on in these data. Okay, but let's focus on this one. And let's ask, is it indeed associated with learning? And sort of repeat the same trick. So we can ask in our model fits, if you condition learning on the presence or absence of replay, can we quantify differential effect of a reward? So the person gets a reward, and in the model, we're estimating how much effect does it have on later choices in terms of a learning rate, depending whether we can detect replay significantly or not. And there is a difference. So the reward has a bigger effect if replay is present than if it's absent. This is, of course, not true for the 30 millisecond forward replay. That doesn't have any effect, which is not surprising since it represents, for the most part, the wrong trajectories. Okay, so people learn more about the replayed paths. The last link of the chain is whether the neural replay itself follows the priority. And indeed it does. So the backward replay, the non-local one, the one we think is interesting, it has a significantly higher sequence strength for high priority paths compared to low priority ones. And again, that's not true for the forward replay at 30 milliseconds. So the backward replay seems to be prioritized according to our definition, or consistent with our definition. Okay, so that's the end of this study. And again, I think it's kind of exciting that it worked, but it's really exciting that we could do this with much cleaner single trial measurements in animals going forward. So I'm excited about both things. But in terms of the questions we started out with, it seems like we do have good evidence that this trajectory replay really does support non-local learning. So people learn more about paths that are replayed. This has been a really long-standing functional proposal, but because people never really recorded replay in tasks in which animals were actually making choices and learning, there wasn't really much support for it. So I think this in some ways is the first good support for this idea. And it's also in this particular setting, it appears to be driven completely by backward replay at outcome time and not, for instance, forward deliberation at choice time, which is an interesting observation. And the second question is, of course, whether this learning replays are prioritized. And we have both behavioral and neural evidence for that. Behaviorally, it seems like people learn more about the states that have high priority, and neurally, those states are replayed preferentially. And so this is at least consistent with sort of more specific predictions of the Matar model that we talked about. So apart from rats, we're excited to think about, can we use similar methods and models to perhaps study dysfunctional biased replay in patients in things like rumination or worry or craving. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, who I think I mentioned already. And I'm happy to have questions and discussion with you guys.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. That was incredible. Thank you so much. People, feel free to show your camera if you've got questions that you'd like to ask on video. If you cannot, then feel free to put your questions in the chat.
Looks like Barry had his hand up. But...
Go ahead, you can field the questions, Nathaniel.
Flavia's turned on her camera and Barry had his hand up, but now it's gone. Maybe he.
I was actually clapping. I didn't.
Oh.
So I had two hands up.
Oh, I see.
Like
Never mind then.
Well, then, given that you've put me on the spot, let me ask you a really naive question, which is, I mean, when you were formulating the model, you were talking about animals finding a path to an outcome. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I'm intrigued to know how this maps onto how you began the talk, talking about model-free, model-based reinforcement learning. So, and I did hear what you said, that the rat experiments are being planned and that you haven't actually done them. But I just wonder, what would something like outcome devaluation do to this replay model when you've got animals in an environment?
So let's say there are a few things to say about that. So the first thing is, compared to an instrumental lever pressing task, one of the differences between the sort of model-based framework and an action outcome association is that it emphasizes multi-step sequentiality. So a lot of the action is about trajectories instead of just single action outcome links. So sort of generalization of the logic. But the one-step lever outcome is sort of as a case of it, of course. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that we've done is basically the way to think about, I think, this new model is that we've sort of taken the sort of model-based or action outcome evaluation, and we're unpacking it in a more granular fashion. So instead of saying that you just compute the action outcome value of the lever press, we're saying you need to think about this particular action, this particular outcome, or this particular trajectory, and a whole package of those would have, been the full model-based evaluations. This is now a sort of more granular account of that, and so you can have sort of habit-like phenomena, which are sort of like habits, but it's not as a failure to think about a particular path as opposed to a failure to think at all, right? So the way we think about reward evaluation is the same. We're thinking about finding a reward that you didn't know that was there before. That's information that you need to push around to other choice points. That could be supported by replay, and particular reward evaluation results in the context of a multi-step task or an action outcome task. The prediction would be that the successful ability to incorporate the replay, the devalued information into choice would be accompanied by action outcome replay, and failure would be accompanied by the lack of action outcome replay. It's easier to do that in space than in upper and lever pressing, because in space you know the neural code. That's the difference. So that's the you could do it with devaluation, and that's the prediction.
Right.
Thanks. So I don't know how Lydia is, if I'm taking my own questions here, it looks like Lydia and then Flavia and then Levon are in order.
Hi. Sorry, should I speak?
Sure.
Go ahead, Lydia.
Okay. Unfortunately, I cannot turn on my camera, but I can just ask the question like this, if this is okay. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a couple of questions. The first one would be the stimulus that right now the humans in this case are taking is just a visual stimuli in the different points of the pathway. Do you think they would also have this fast and slow replay if you had a more complex set of stimuli? So for example, there was some noise at the same time of the visual stimuli, the different paths.
It's a good question. So I don't think, so the question of the speed is sort of quite mysterious. Like, what is it? What does 30 milliseconds mean, and what does 140 milliseconds mean? So that's the sort of state to state. You know, the pictures sort of appear with that latency, or you know, the decodes of those pictures on average appear with that latency. I believe in other papers, Yunsei and Tim and their collaborators and Ray have seen more of the fast replay, if I'm not mistaken, at 30 or 40 milliseconds, and less of the slow replay. All of which is to say, I think it probably depends on the circumstances and on the task. So I don't have a particular commitment to the particular speed that we saw. In terms of, could it be harder or easier? You know, could it be slower if it were harder or more noisy or something? It certainly could be. I think, you know, one thing that's striking about all this replay, both in humans and animals, is that it's awfully fast. It sort of wouldn't be, you know, it's not the speed at which you consciously deliberate about a series of chess moves or something. I think it's sort of faster than that, I would say. And it's faster than real time, which I think suggests that, somewhat contrary to our model, it's sort of more ballistic than, you know, involves, there's not a lot of online control. There's not a lot of time for a lot of, you know, meta deliberation about steering the deliberation. So again, I think our model is more about what are the principles for which this is tuned than how does it actually work. I think how it actually works has to be sort of automatic, almost ballistic, governed by the statistics of experience. So I'm not sure quite what that means with respect to your particular question about if it's noisy, but presumably if it's, you know, reliable enough that the brain can figure out what the sequence is, maybe it would still replay fast, but I think we don't really know. Does that help? I mean, I'm not sure I have a good answer. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, my second question, I think you've already answered a bit, which was why those times, whether those specific times mean actually something more from a computational perspective.
Maybe not from a computational perspective, but I mean, one of them's close to theta, right? So that's suggestive. That is, I think, 140 milliseconds, you know, is roughly once per cycle of theta. Although, so that's not, you know, that's suggestive, theta being an important rhythm in the hippocampus. But other than that, I don't have a lot to say.
Thank you.
Sure. Flavia, do you want to?
Yes, so I have a question about, so thanks very much for your talk. I have a question about the gain component. So I understand, I think it goes between 0 and 1, so it's either, you know, maximum gains when, you know, it maximize rewards, and either it should go to 0 for no rewards. Is that right?
It's in units of reward, so it's actually in units of expected. I'm just going to see if I can bring up the equation. It's in units of expected discounted future reward. So let me see if I can share the screen again. So it's not actually 0 to 1, but yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
What I was wondering is what happens when in the case in which there is a punishment. So a punishment is not necessarily the same as not having a reward, an actual punishment. You know, it could be driven by a parallel kind of learning system with its own learning rate. It's not necessarily, I mean, there is quite a lot of work whether punishments are learned, you know, using the same system, so that you basically have the same learning rate. Goes up and down depending on whether you are punishment or not. And I know that you're fitting. Actually, you're fitting that data set in which, sorry for the background noise, the data set with which you actually had shocks, and you explain and you explain quite well. But I was wondering what's your interpretation? So when you had punishment, it would actually this framework would be sufficient to explain the kind of learning that happens, because you could consider priorities are different when you're learning from rewards and punishments, and sometimes learning from punishments is actually super fast. very, very fast.
Yeah, I think in general, learning rates for punishments are very fast. I think that's right. For shocks and so on, you haven't got one trouble.
Yeah.
The finding with shocks, I didn't say this very well. The experimental finding is in the sort of conditioned place aversion scenario. There's an animal is shocked in some location once. He runs out of that location, and later on he runs up to that location, and then you see a lot of replay in his brain which looks like it's replaying thinking about going into that location, and he sort of creeps up to it but doesn't go to it. I think that is consistent with it. Maybe that's your sort of logic. That's a very important, assuming that it's not 0, 1, right? If the utility, as it were, of a big shock is a big negative number, if these rewards are sort of measured in units of utility, let's say, and that shock is very salient, it has a big negative utility, that's a very important mistake not to make. And so the brain is devoting a lot of replay to evaluating that action and pushing the information, that if I take this step, I'm going to get a big shock, into the evaluation of that step. So I think doing a lot of replay at that point could support the high behavioral learning rate, if that makes sense, right? It's because there's, you might repeatedly replay that, or with high probability, high priority replay that path. So in general, the objective function of these reinforcement learning algorithms is in units of expected utility or expected discounted cumulative future utility. So it can be negative and positive, and gain is defined as a change in that. That is, if I think how much better does my expected future utility get? So in the case of I could make a mistake and walk into a big negative shock, and if I think enough that I don't make that mistake, that's actually got a positive gain, right? That's got a gain of sort of, let's say 10 utility if the shock is worth -10. That's why it has priority. It's actually got a positive gain by avoiding a negative punishment. But I certainly wouldn't, I don't mean to rule out the important evidence that rewards and punishments are as it in terms of the neural implementation
no. So
dealt with separately. Yeah.
You're saying that basically this framework should be sufficient to explain for like avoidance, or you don't necessarily need a separate component for like loss, or it would be.
It's a loss and avoidance, or
yeah.
That's right. It's part, at least it's a very abstract framework, right? Like we can reason about it, but Levon.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much for a really, really interesting talk. My question is I guess a bit more general. So in animals, we have information from the hippocampus, from the place cells, from single cell recordings, whereas here you have MEG. I guess looking at all the sensors. I was wondering if you could describe the differences. So you have a non-spatial task in the case of humans versus a spatial task in animals. And as far as I'm not an MEG expert, but as far as I know, it's difficult to pick up signals specifically from the hippocampus with MEG. So what do you think it's measuring? And does it matter that it's a non-spatial task, just decoding pictures? Would it also work with the spatial task in humans?
I don't think we have the technology, the measurement technology to decode location representations in people, unfortunately. It would be nice if we did, but as you say, I don't think it's not just that it's hard to get signals from hippocampus, it's just that they're not spatially organized in a way that I think you can decode place cell activity. People have place cells, I think is well demonstrated, but we can't decode them with MEG because they're too packed close together. So I think the source, let's see. So people have done this basic approach of decoding image categories is of course very widely used in fMRI, where it's pretty clear, because the spatial resolution is much clearer, that the source of these decodes is sort of ventral, is higher visual cortex, right? That's not to say that, I think people believe that replay events in the hippocampus, there's evidence that it's coordinated with evoking, that probably hippocampus is sort of driving that event. But one of the things that people imagine replay is doing, and there's some evidence for this, is evoking representations in the rest of the brain. This is sort of, this operation is associated with sort of systems consolidation and so on. So that you have this sort of integrative multimodal representation hippocampus that is both subserving a memory, but also sort of, evoking that memory across a lot of the source cortex. So that's the way people think about it. Whether that's what we see in MEG, we are indeed using all the sensors to decode image category and not specifically trying to ask what in the brain is doing this. We're just trying to decode if people are thinking about images and when, in what order. I'm not sure. So you can run these source localization algorithms on the activity, and Yunse did that. And I think it pointed for the backward replay that we're so interested in, it pointed to cortex overlying hippocampus and not to hippocampus itself. I'm not sure I would take that to the bank either way, but for what it's worth, that's what we saw. But again, I think the technology in humans is what it is. And this is sort of the best we can do so far. But rodents are exciting precisely because obviously we have much more invasive measurements and we know the neural code for location.
Thank you.
Sure.
Paul, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm going to jump out of my box in a minute and come and talk to you in person. But yeah, I could ask a question now. I've got lots of questions. It was a really interesting talk, really interesting ideas. One thing that occurred to me is you asked, you said in this ECB, I think it was, calculation, that the animal will evaluate this for every possible location in order to decide what location to think about. And I immediately thought, well, hang on a second, isn't that a very computationally demanding thing? And are we going to end up in a situation where you now have to decide how much time you should allocate to thinking about what you should be thinking about? So how do you see that? Is there a different way?
Yeah, sorry, that was I was trying to make the point that that's not, of course we don't believe that. So yes, it is true that the way we do this computation is by a very exhaustive kind of MATLAB program that searches over every location. But of course it would be insane for the brain to do that, because the whole point is that the brain is trying to figure out which sparse computation to do, and it can't do all of them to decide which one would be worth doing. That of course is sort of worse than circular. How do I sleep at night having just said that? The point is, we're not trying to like build a better mousetrap here. We're not trying. This is sort of be an in principle examination of what are the principles. The first sort of principle explanation for how this should work if this is what it were tuned for. The question of what are the mechanisms that would support this efficiently is a sort of separate question, or an important question that is logically subsequent, and I think we have some ideas about that as well. You need approximations to these computations that are sort of cheap, rules of thumb that sort of comply with these general things. But this is like sort of like an ideal observer model, right? In the sense of, if you knew, what would be the best thing to replay, and it turns out to have interesting patterns, and that's what we're sort of investigating.
Are there any other questions? I'll ask one question of my own while people just think if they have any last minute questions. It's again about timing and your comment about awareness, possibly also related to Paul's question about the resources needed for computation. So you did try to connect this method, these ideas to mental health disorders, to rumination, to PTSD, where trauma surfaces as intrusions to consciousness. So there is some way in which intuitively we connect it to consciousness, even if it's not quite quite clear. And I just had when Flavia was asking about punishment, I had this sense that I think a lot of people have, but we purposely don't talk about, of when we drive down a motorway, just imagining what it would be like to veer off to the other side. That's like a replay. The only way, maybe a reason that we have that is that we actually are computing it in order not to do it. I never thought about it in this computational way. But can you say something about awareness and whether the timing differences that you observed in the experiment can tell us something about that? Were people aware of the replay that is done?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think we asked them. And yeah, it's a good question. So let's see. What can I say about that? Yeah, so it certainly is the case for all of not just the intrusions, but rumination and worry, and all those things are clearly conscious. And I think the content of them might be a little hard to assign a speed to, right? Maybe they're faster than real life, right? I think they're the same kind of principles, and the same kind of operational points could apply to mental activity, whether it's conscious or unconscious. I don't know also if you believe that you are, if any of us feel like we're conscious of sort of trajectory evaluation type or trajectory simulation type things that are presumably happening in our brains similar to rats. I don't feel like I know about that, but maybe I don't know which those things are and what they feel like. I've never focused too much on the question of whether something is conscious or not, because in terms of the information processing questions, it doesn't seem like it matters. But it is true that some of the phenomena that would be interested in examining are things that people are conscious of, like worry and rumination. And maybe that's an opportunity that we can actually ask them about it and assess it. And maybe it's not the same thing that is being measured in the rats or in this particular experiment, but it could have the same function. It could follow the same principles, or it could not, and it's worthy of investigating anyway. That's, I guess, all I can say. But,
great, thank you very much. I think we could, you and I could probably talk about this for a while longer. Barry, did you have another question? Your camera is back.
I think Barry logged out.
No, I'm here.
Oh, he wrote that he was logging out.
I have to step out pretty soon. No, my question is a bit off tack, actually, Nathaniel. And
sure.
So I'll go for it. I mean, I'm still stuck on habits, I'm afraid.
Oh, good.
And slightly frustrated the way people map straightforwardly model-free reinforcement learning onto habits without critical thought. But I've been very taken by the theorizing by computational as well, by Miller et al., which I'm sure you know about, which kind of reverts to the view that habits develop through direct strengthening of recently taken actions rather than encoding outcomes. And that it seems to account for many of the manifestations of habits, including insensitivity to outcome devaluation, contingency degradation, and also can account for phenomena like perseveration in repetitive tasks like reversal learning tasks. And I wonder where that sits with you. And I'm sorry, because it's not about what you were talking about.
Yeah, no, that's
today.
fine.
It's just in my head.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. So let's see. So I guess my reaction to that, I could believe that is a thing. There may be more than one kind of habit, right? So I may be partly responsible for the uncritical association of habits with model-free learning, in that I think, I always thought it was very striking that the predominant view of learning in the brain, at the time when we were all working on this, was this model-free temporal difference learning rule that has the property of producing habits is actually very similar to sort of a whole kind of reinforcement rule, right? It learns these policies. It doesn't do a great job explaining contingency degradation. It's true,
which is pretty important as a
yeah.
criteria.
I mean, I have thoughts about that, but that might be another discussion. But it is striking that there's a neural mechanism that seems like it's pretty well demonstrated or pieces of it that are pretty well demonstrated that seems to produce some habit-like phenomena. I think it's also the case that this other mechanism, sort of almost like direct heavy and strengthening, could also be a factor, maybe at a different degree of overtraining, for instance. I could certainly believe that. I think the issue with that, I actually talked to Tony about this, and Tony was on before, I don't know, back when Kevin was first talking about it. Historically, the issue was extinction, right? That it's hard for these models to explain extinction. And my understanding was that in the early days, that was why this view of habits was disfavored compared to the sort of stamping in one. You sort of, I think they both have some issues, and they both might be right in some circumstances and wrong in some circumstances. But yeah, so Miller's, I work with Miller on some stuff as well. He's also here. He's also great here in the UK.
I didn't know that, and I just noticed. I think I was just when you mentioned Tony, I saw he's been on the call, but he ducked out when we might have put him on the spot. So.
Oh, I see. Anyway, no, it's literally like when Kevin first started talking about this, I wrote to Tony to ask, isn't that, he had told me about that, historically, as a view of habits that sort of hadn't taken. Yeah, maybe one more thing to say is that there's interesting results from Alana Witten and others about dopamine in dorsomedial striatum, among other places, which seems to be sort of responsive to actions and not to rewards. And so it seems like just the action of dopamine there might, just the obvious kind of learning rule, might produce sort of Miller-like habits, although it's dorsomedial, but anyway, it's what it is.
It doesn't quite map onto the traditional circuitry.
Yeah, but it's striking the fact that it's not, that it's more modulated by the action and not by the reward is reminiscent. That was what I thought was interesting. But yeah.
Okay, sorry to divert you.
No, it's fun.
So if that was the last question, I'd like to thank Nathaniel for a great talk. And those of you who are interested in joining us for a drink, we'll meet downstairs in just a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
And enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye.